I didn't expect a celebration, but I expected a knock. Even during the harder years, someone always knocked once on the shoulder, once on the heart, enough to say, "We didn't forget you." I never said I needed to be included. I only ever needed not to be erased. The gravel was familiar under my boots, round white polished like the stones in my father's garden path. He used to rake them straight even when it rained. My sister said it made the house look like a catalogue. I always thought it made it look like no one lived there. Cars were already parked in 2 rows. The newer ones had out-of-state plates. The older ones I recognized Lauren's silver SUV, Aunt Diane's maroon Lexus, the dusty green truck that used to belong to Uncle Paul before he handed it off to his son. I counted 7. There was no room for one more. Through the side window, I caught a glimpse of the dining room chandelier. It flickered slightly soft and round like always. The table underneath it had been extended the way we only did for holidays or family business. I saw plates, napkins, tall glasses. A flash of someone's gold watch. I reached for my phone. Nothing. No text, no missed calls, no group chat. I stood for a full minute before knocking. The door didn't open. I waited, then knocked again, flat-palmed, soft, just enough to be heard over whatever music or conversation was floating behind the walls. It was Claire who answered. Her hair was pinned up loosely, a few white strands curling along her neck. She didn't smile. Her body filled just enough of the doorway to block the light. Her cardigan, same one she used to wear, while making apple bread, hung limp over a collared shirt. She looked at me for a second too long. Then she glanced over her shoulder, then back at me. "Miss Lauren said." She hesitated, eyes falling to the ground. "This one's just for us." That word, us, hung in the air like stale perfume. Claire shifted her weight hands, folding over each other. Her voice had always been gentle. Now it was quiet, the way people speak at hospital beds. I gave a small nod. Not agreement, just acknowledgement. Then stepped back. She didn't apologize. She didn't close the door quickly, just slowly, deliberately. The lock clicked into place like the end of a sentence. As I walked back down the stone path, the porch light warmed the top of my coat, the same coat I wore last winter, with the thread coming loose at the hem. I never stitched it. Never got around to replacing the button on the inside cuff, either. The loose one kept twisting the fabric slightly every time I put my hand in my pocket. The garden looked clipped, curated. There used to be a bird bath under the second maple, but it was gone. The mulch had been replaced with white rock and ground ivy. No sign of my father's wooden bench, the one we sanded together when I was 12. He let me hold the varnish brush. I remember him telling me not to rush. At the curb, I didn't turn around. There was nothing behind me that hadn't already closed. By the time I got back to my apartment, the sun had dipped low enough that the hallway outside my door was already in shadow. I left the light off. My kitchen was silent except for the ticking clock and the soft hum of the refrigerator. I dropped my keys into the bowl near the sink and sat down at the small table with only one chair. The envelope was where I left it on the edge unopened. I had picked it up that morning just before leaving. I thought it was a form letter. It looked like one. Light blue, heavy paper, my full name printed in serif font. No return address. I didn't open it. I just turned it over once in my hand, ran my thumb along the edge, where the glue had curled slightly from the humidity. There was a faint crease in one corner, like someone had pressed too hard against it in the mail sorter. It seemed older than it was. It was from the bank. I knew that without reading. I had seen enough of their stationery to recognize the spacing. The real news was always between the lines. A week ago, Lauren had mentioned that the estate was being re-evaluated. No details, no numbers, no decisions. That's how she spoke now, like things simply happened like weather or traffic. Months ago, after the funeral, she asked for the spare keys to the house. It's just easier if I handle things, she told me, already reaching out her hand. And I gave them. I didn't ask for clarification. I didn't want to be difficult. I was tired. And maybe some part of me still believed in the idea that we were a family, that grief might soften edges, that death might make space. Tonight, I knew better. I turned the envelope once more, then set it down gently on the tabletop. The corner lifted just slightly, catching the glow from the refrigerator light. I left it there, untouched. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a missed message. It wasn't forgetfulness or oversight. It was exclusion. And it had a return address after all, just not one that needed to be printed. I used to measure my worth by how little space I took up. There's a photo somewhere, probably in one of Lauren's scrapbooks, where the entire family is gathered under a rented white tent. My mother is in the center, wearing pearl earrings and holding a crystal flute. Lauren is off to the side, mid-laugh, head tilted at just the right angle for light to find her cheekbones, and I'm seated in the second row, half-turned, half-shadowed, adjusting the hem of a dress that wasn't mine. It was the dress my mother picked out for her 60th. A champagne color with sleeves that itched at the wrists. She handed it to me on a hanger 2 weeks before the party. No tags, no receipt, just folded, tissue tucked into the neckline. "This will photograph better," she said, glancing briefly at my reflection, not hers. I stood at the back of the patio that evening, watching servers circle the yard with trays of crab cakes and chilled wine. Lauren was being ushered between guests, old family friends, retired colleagues, people who used to send us Christmas cards with gold-embossed signatures. Each time the camera flashed, she leaned in like she belonged to all of them. At one point, I walked toward the catering table, trying to offer help. Plates needed clearing. A vase had tipped over near the cake. My mother touched my arm lightly, 2 fingers through silk. "Just sit for now," she said. "You'll shift the symmetry." I returned to the edge of the crowd, holding a glass of sparkling cider. No one had remembered to refill. The hem of my dress kept catching the chair leg. It didn't feel like mine. Nothing did. That night, I hung the dress back in the closet and closed the door without turning on the light. Years earlier, I came home on leave after my first overseas deployment. The plane landed just after dawn, and I went straight from the airport to the house still in uniform. I hadn't called ahead. I wanted it to be a surprise. The table had already been set when I arrived, cloth napkins, mother's china, the heavy water glasses we never used. I laid my bag by the door and took the seat I always used to take. No one commented on the ribbons. My jacket was folded over the back of the chair, the creases still sharp from the base laundry. My father reached for the butter dish and passed it down without looking up. "You've been thinking about going back to school," he said, cutting into his toast. I looked down at my plate. The eggs had cooled. The fork had left an impression in the yolk. I hear the law program at Georgetown still takes late applications. The only sound after that was the scrape of silverware against porcelain. Later that week, Lauren handed me a folded brochure from a firm she worked with. She didn't speak, just placed it on the table beside my coffee. It was always like that. Unspoken offers of alternate paths, better optics, easier names to explain at dinner parties. I never refused outright. I just delayed. I answered politely. I dressed safely. I learned to smile with restraint. I sent cards for holidays I wasn't invited to, called on birthdays even when they didn't answer. There was a time when I thought it was enough, that if I did the right things in the right order and asked for nothing in return, I'd eventually be allowed to stay. When Lauren moved into her first apartment, I drove her furniture across state lines in a rented van. She forgot to give me the security code for the building. I waited outside for 20 minutes, then carried everything up the service stairs when she finally buzzed me in. At the end of the day, she handed me a bottle of mineral water and said, "You've always been the practical one." I thanked her like it was a compliment. On Mother's Day the following year, I sent a pressed flower arrangement and a handwritten note. I never got confirmation it arrived, but in one of the photos posted online, I saw it in the corner of the mantel, no card visible, just the petals, wilting. Even then I thought maybe I was imagining the distance. Maybe I was just too intense, too difficult, too trained to scan for silence like it meant something. So I tried softer. I used smaller words. I avoided the term medic when I introduced myself at family events. I said worked in logistics or support operations. Once I even said administration. No one asked further. At dinner with extended family, someone asked Lauren what it was like being the face of her firm's newest campaign. My uncle leaned toward me after dessert and whispered, "Must be nice to have such a star in the family." I smiled, took a sip of decaf. Didn't ask who he meant. There's a coffee cup I still keep in my kitchen, the one with the faded red stripes chipped at the rim. It came from my father's office. I used it when I was home on leave. Once he saw me pouring into it and said, "Didn't know anyone still touched that thing." I wiped it clean before I left that night, then packed it in my duffel. Not out of sentimentality, just to prove to myself I could keep something they hadn't thrown away. I don't remember when I stopped trying to be invited. It didn't happen all at once. It was more like slowly stepping backward until no one noticed you were missing. I never kicked down the door. Never shouted at a table. I just waited too long outside houses that used to have my name on the mailbox. I wasn't the loud one. I wasn't the fighter. I was the one who tried to take up less air, just enough to be allowed in. And somehow even that was too much. Some erasures are done in soft focus. The photo wall in the living room had changed over the years. Newer frames replaced the old brass ones, sleeker now, with clean edges and no dust. Lauren's college graduation took up the center space. Her in a navy cap, chin lifted, flanked by both our parents. The words, "Legacy of Excellence," printed across the matte in embossed gold. Below it, a smaller photo of her ribbon-cutting ceremony at the firm's new headquarters, smiling. Shaking hands, another caption in the same font, "Leadership from the start." There was one photo of me, far left near the window. I wasn't facing the camera, only the side of my face visible, cropped by someone else's shoulder. The lighting was uneven. My name wasn't written below. Once, when a neighbor came over for coffee, she looked at the wall and said, "Lauren really made a name for herself, didn't she?" I stirred my tea and nodded. My name was on the invitation list for a memorial ceremony 3 years ago. It had been printed beneath the words, "Distinguished Honorees," followed by my rank and unit. I sat in the third row of the amphitheater, the flag behind us fluttering stiff in the breeze. When my name was read, I stood nodded and sat back down. No one from my family was there. The next morning I checked my phone. One message, 3 words. "Good for you." No punctuation, no follow-up. I remember looking at the screen longer than I should have. Then I deleted it. Not out of spite, just to free the space. That Thanksgiving, I brought a dish my father used to ask for every year, corn casserole with thyme and black pepper. I used his old recipe card, still creased in the corner with a faint smear of oil along the top edge. I placed the dish at the end of the buffet table beside Lauren's cranberry tart. I watched my mother take a bite. She didn't comment right away. She dabbed her mouth with a napkin, then reached for her glass. "Lauren was right," she said, almost like an aside. "You're better with people than with food." I folded the serving spoon back into the dish and walked away. No one asked why I stopped cooking after that. The ring I wore back then was my grandmother's thin gold, flattened slightly on one edge from years of wear. She had given it to me during her last winter, slipping it into my hand in a waiting room without a word. No one noticed it missing until weeks later. My mother mentioned it once over brunch. "She always meant to leave that to Lauren," she said, folding her napkin. "You probably didn't know." I looked down at my hand. I never wore it again. There's a notepad in my drawer, lined, yellowed, frayed at the corners. On it are gift lists from birthdays past. I used to make notes about who liked what, who preferred wine to books, which wrapping paper was too plain, too loud, too wasteful. Once I sent Lauren a leather-bound planner engraved with her initials. It arrived on time, tracked insured. When I visited her office later that year, I saw another planner on her desk, still in plastic. "This one has more structure," she said, not looking up. The next year, I sent a card. There were moments I excused all of it. Maybe I hadn't been clear. Maybe I had been gone too long. Maybe I missed the rhythm families fall into when they see each other often enough to fill silences with meaning. But over time, I saw it. The pattern, the polite gaps, the careful omissions, the way my name was used only when necessary on seating charts in formal announcements, when someone needed to balance the visual symmetry of a group. At Lauren's engagement dinner, someone clinked a glass and stood to toast. The speech was practiced, full of metaphors. When they finished, the table turned to my mother for her remarks. She smiled, lifted her wine, and said, "I always knew one of my daughters would bring us honor." There was a pause. No one corrected her. I didn't lift my glass. At first, I told myself it wasn't meant that way, that people speak in shorthand, that they forget how words fall. But forgetting when repeated often enough becomes a method. At the end of the night, Lauren leaned in beside me and adjusted the fold of my scarf. "You're always so composed," she said. "I wish I had your quiet." I wondered then if silence looked like obedience to her or surrender. I kept the scarf, though. It still carries a faint trace of the perfume she wore that night. Bergamot, shop too clean. I haven't washed it since. My father once gave me a pocket knife when I turned 16. It had a wooden handle worn smooth from his own use. He handed it to me without a box. "It's not for display," he said. "It's for knowing what you're capable of." The blade dulled over the years. I kept it anyway. I used to believe if I loved them long enough, they'd love back. That time had weight and effort had memory, that the consistency of showing up would mean something in a room that didn't want me loud. But I know now forgetting can be active, and some names aren't missed, they're removed. There's a sound that happens just before silence, something brittle, almost like breath being held in too many chests at once. I didn't hear my name at first, not the way she said it. I stood beside the table, back straight, palms flat on the wood. The seal on my uniform was centered. My shoes polished to regulation gloss. I had checked twice before entering the courtroom, not out of pride but habit. Precision was the last thing I still had control over. The bailiff called for order. Papers shuffled, microphones buzzed, a throat cleared. Then her voice sliced through the static. She doesn't deserve that medal. Take it off. No emphasis. Just cold delivery. Like reading from a list of expired items. Margaret didn't stand all the way just enough to be seen. Her pearl earrings barely moved. Her hand, still manicured, hovered in the air, more gesture than rage. I didn't look at her. Chairs creaked. Someone dropped a pen. No one spoke. Beside her, Lauren didn't blink. She smoothed her skirt and leaned forward slightly enough to be caught by the cameras. She lied to all of us, she said. A uniform doesn't make someone a hero. I didn't speak. My hand moved on its own, slow and deliberate. The clasp on my jacket gave easily. 2 fingers, 1 motion. The medal came off clean. I placed it on the table. Not thrown, not surrendered, just set down, face up. For a moment it caught the courtroom lights just enough to reflect, not enough to shine. The judge didn't interrupt. The court reporter looked up, then back at her keyboard. No one asked why I complied. No one wondered what it cost. The defense. Their defense began their presentation. David Sandler, sharply dressed, smiled with his mouth only. He walked toward the screen with the comfort of someone who had rehearsed. This recording, he said, was taken the night before the decedent passed. The screen lit up. Grainy footage. A hallway I recognized. My voice slightly raised. Not yelling. Just frayed. You never respected me. All I ever did was try. A pause. Then my father's voice raspy. You disrespected the family name! The image flickered. My silhouette stood still, hand on the doorframe. You never wanted a daughter, I said. You wanted a soldier you could display. Then his voice again. And look at what you became. The clip ended with my voice clipped short by the cut. Maybe I became what you made me. The room absorbed the words like a sponge dropped in bleach. No one asked what came next. No one mentioned I had returned to his room, that I had knelt beside him. That Barsad, I had held his hand until it went cold. Lauren crossed her legs. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a tissue she hadn't used until the cameras turned. The judge asked if I had a response. I stood. The medal still sat on the table. I didn't touch it. No response, I said. Thomas, seated beside me, leaned in, his voice barely audible. We could challenge the video's context. I shook my head. One small movement. Enough. They're rewriting you, he whispered. I adjusted the sleeve of my jacket where the thread had frayed. They're not finished yet. Across the aisle, someone whispered. I didn't catch the words. A woman I recognized from church meetings avoided my eyes. Once she gave me a ride after my car stalled. She brought a blanket for my legs and told me I looked tired. Today she looked down as I passed. No one raised a hand. No one stood. I thought briefly of the folded napkin from a fundraiser dinner years ago. Lauren had spoken that night about resilience, about family, strength, about being the product of great values. She thanked our parents for raising 2 daughters who each found their own way to serve. Afterward, she handed me a copy of her speech and said, You were mentioned. Not named. Mentioned. Now I sat in a courtroom where my existence had been reduced to a clip and a courtroom transcript. There was no mention of deployment logs, field reports, the letter from the unit commander, the lives listed in red and black ink on the board outside the tent. There was no mention of the note my father left, folded into his medical chart the day before he slipped into unconsciousness. It hadn't been entered into evidence. Not yet. I sat still. I listened. I let them talk. Lauren adjusted her microphone. Her presence at the house, she said, was never about care. It was about control. Margaret nodded, once slow and purposeful. She took advantage while the rest of us were grieving. I counted the seconds between their statements. They landed with rhythm, like rehearsed lines. No one flinched. I folded my hands in my lap. The medal stayed on the table untouched. The clip remained paused on the screen, my outline, my voice cut off at its sharpest point. Not incomplete, just edited. Their story was tidy, neat, well lit. It only missed one thing, the part that was true. Some exits don't need doors, just the decision not to turn around. The courthouse emptied in clusters, heels against tile, hushed exchanges just loud enough to be caught by nearby microphones. I moved with the last group, not fast, not slow, just present enough not to draw attention. No one reached for my arm. No camera followed me past the steps. My name had already finished its cycle in the early afternoon news. It would trail off by evening, swallowed in politics, sports, and the next family feud dressed in courtroom lighting. Outside, Thomas caught up. His folder was tucked under one arm, his brow creased but unreadable. I had seen him navigate testimonies with tighter margins. We could go on record, he offered. Just something short, clarify the medal wasn't revoked officially. I kept walking. The sidewalk had a chip in it near the parking meter like someone had kicked it in frustration. There's a microphone waiting across the street. 5 minutes. Or even a quote I can pass along. The badge on my jacket was gone. My hands stayed at my sides. I know this isn't about image, he added. But silence reads like guilt. I paused by the passenger side door. My reflection in the window held no expression. The collar of my shirt had loosened slightly, creased from the hours of sitting. It's not fear, I said. I just don't like shouting in a room full of people who've already decided not to listen. He nodded once. Not agreement, just acknowledgement. Back at the house, I placed the keys inside a plain envelope. No return address, no note, just the metal resting in paper like something that no longer fit a lock. The envelope slipped easily through the mail slot. The house never made a sound. A week later, I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment near the edge of town. It used to be part of a converted farmhouse. The paint peeled at the windowsills, and the radiator ticked at night like a metronome off tempo. I brought only what I could, carry my uniform in a garment bag, a tea kettle wrapped in towels, and the old rucksack I never quite unpacked after Afghanistan. There was no television. The bookshelf leaned slightly left. I pressed a folded napkin beneath one leg to keep it steady. On the second day, Thomas called again. I didn't answer. He left a message about an interview request from Channel 8, then one from the Courier. He used the phrase public narrative. I deleted the message. Lauren went on air the next night. Her blouse perfectly pressed her tone warm and rehearsed. My sister's always had a complicated relationship with duty, she said. I just hope wherever she is, she remembers that honor isn't something you demand. It's something you maintain. I watched the clip once. The mug in my hand was chipped along the rim. I turned it slightly to avoid the crack. The reporter asked her if she thought I would respond. She doesn't need to, Lauren said. Her silence says everything. A month passed, then 2. The invitations stopped. The letters never came. No one from the family reached out, not even the distant cousins who used to send fruit baskets at Christmas. At the hardware store, a woman in line recognized me. Her son had played Little League with Lauren's stepson. I always thought you had more poise, she said, placing her canned paint on the counter. But I suppose everyone cracks eventually. I smiled without answering. Paid in cash, carried the wrench and curtain rod out in one hand. There's a kind of quiet that doesn't ask for approval. Just a place to exist. I fixed the curtain rod myself. The first hole I drilled was crooked. I left it there. When the local paper printed an editorial about the silence of a soldier, I didn't correct them. When an old colleague from base sent a text, "You holding up. Let me know if you want to set the record straight," I left it unread. Setting records straight assumes someone is listening. Lauren wrote one final piece for the Family Foundation's newsletter. "We believe in second chances," she wrote. "Even when people choose to disappear, we remain committed to healing." I folded the paper into thirds and placed it under the leg of the bookshelf, replacing the napkin. The only light in the apartment came from the window beside the stove. In the mornings, it cast long lines across the chipped tile floor. The tea kettle steamed slowly. Sometimes I let the whistle go on longer than needed. I kept the medal inside the drawer, not on display, not discarded, just there. When someone asked about it once at the market, I looked at the list in my hand and said, "That's not something I talk about." They didn't press. Most people don't when you say nothing with enough certainty. Thomas stopped calling. The press moved on. The silence didn't feel like a vacuum. It felt like a decision I kept making, not because I was small, or afraid, or defeated, but because sometimes silence isn't absence, it's resistance unspoken. A kind of strength that doesn't require applause. The kind that knows noise never healed anything. Some mornings begin with the sound of your own breath, as if the body is reminding itself it's still here. The cabin sat at the edge of Ash Hollow, tucked behind a line of cedar trees that bent with the wind, like they remembered another life. No neighbors close enough to wave, just space. Cold air seeped through the floorboards at night. I folded towels along the baseboards to keep it out. Not perfect, but enough. I didn't bring much, just the rucksack, the tin kettle with a dent near the spout, and the leather notebook that still had a sand grain stuck in the binding. I hadn't written anything in it yet. The pages waited, but I wasn't ready to explain anything, not even to myself. The first few nights I kept waking up at 2:13 a.m. My body still expected the sound of something. A radio, a voice a hallway, argument muffled by drywall. Instead, there was only the ticking from the heater trying its best. On the third night, I dreamed of the long dining table, the polished silverware, the empty chair no one looked toward. Not combat, not injury, just chairs. And who sat where, and who didn't. The closet only had one hanger. I used it for the old uniform now faded at the seams. The patch on the left shoulder was curling. I hung it by the window, not as decoration, not to be proud of, just to remember. I was not invented by them. No one corrected my posture. No one reminded me to smile more for their sake. No one placed a hand over mine and whispered, "Don't stir the water, Vivian. Calm is better." I stirred the tea longer than I needed sometimes until it went cold. I didn't mind. At the small supply store in town, the man behind the counter gave me an extra pack of screws without saying much. Just a nod. I rebuilt the shelf by the front wall, not straight, but sturdy. I sanded the corners by hand until the edges didn't catch on anything anymore. A week in the radio buzzed alive on its own one of those days where the dial must have shifted. A preacher's voice came through halfway between sermon and static. I didn't change the station. Midway through the second week, an envelope arrived without a return address. The postmark read, Tennessee. Inside, one folded piece of paper torn at the edge, written in blue ink. Maybe you don't see it, but I do. I watched you hold that young corporal's hand until he stopped shaking. You didn't say much, just told him dawn would come. You didn't need to say more. Emily. I read it twice, then placed it under the kettle. It kept the corner from rocking. I didn't respond. At the hardware shop, a man asked if I needed help picking stain for the back wall. I said no, then chose one called Harvest Oak. Not because it matched anything, but because the name didn't sound temporary. The wood soaked it in unevenly. One corner stayed darker than the rest. It looked like a bruise, and I didn't paint over it. The mattress creaked when I moved. There was no television, no Wi-Fi, just the sound of wind through pine. I caught myself reaching for my phone once, not to call anyone, but to check the time. I hadn't charged it in days. The screen stayed black. Once I caught a voice in my head. You always needed too much. It wasn't shouted. It had never been shouted. Just placed like a note under a door where it could slide in quietly and stay. I boiled water for rice. No recipe. Just guessed. I put up a coat hook by the door, bent the nail slightly, left it that way. A branch hit the window during a storm, and for a second my body tensed like it used to. Then it passed. On the 15th day, I sat with the notebook in my lap. The pen rested on top, still capped. I thought about writing one sentence, just one, not a confession, not a timeline, just a start. But I didn't. Instead, I cleaned the inside of the kettle. The stain near the bottom had darkened. I scrubbed gently, but didn't try to erase it completely. The silence in the cabin didn't echo. It absorbed. It didn't expect anything from me, didn't ask for a story, didn't care if I believed my own. One afternoon, a squirrel ran across the roof. The noise startled me at first, then made me laugh quietly to myself. It had been a while. I walked to the dock near the lake's edge and sat. I didn't fish, didn't read, just watched the water, not try to be anything other than water. I brought the uniform down and folded it carefully into a box I kept under the bed. Not hidden. Just resting. The kettle clicked softly when it cooled. There were no reminders here to become smaller. No one told me how to behave in order to be welcomed. No one corrected the way I stirred sugar into tea. This cabin may not be a home, but it doesn't ask me to vanish in order to stay. Some messages are meant to be read once and never again, yet they stay folded in the mind like receipts you didn't mean to keep. The phone buzzed while I was washing the kettle. I didn't rush. The screen lit up with 4 words that seemed recycled from a greeting card. Family is forever. No punctuation. Just a name at the bottom. Margaret. I dried my hands slowly, set the phone face down, and finished scrubbing the inside rim. A few days later, an email landed in the inbox I hadn't checked in weeks. Subject: realignment opportunity. The body was short. Too short. The press is being brutal. Let's show unity. It matters now. Lauren never used greetings or sign-offs. She wrote like someone issuing directives, not invitations. I clicked archive, didn't delete it. Just filed it under a name I'd remember: Performative Outreach. Later that night, Whitlow forwarded a public statement Lauren had made during a radio segment. I let the clip play while folding laundry. Her voice had that practiced softness she used during charity galas. We've all made mistakes, but my sister and I are working to heal. I respect her service. We just needed space to understand one another. She didn't mention courtrooms, didn't mention what she called me behind closed doors, didn't mention the medal placed face down in a public hearing. The laundry sat in a half-folded pile. The navy sweater still smelled faintly of cedar from the drawer. I folded it tighter, aligned the sleeves, then stood still for a long moment, without realizing I wasn't blinking. Another email came the next morning from a media outlet asking for my side of the story. They used the phrase, redemption arc. I didn't reply. By the end of the week, someone from the mayor's office called. Would you consider joining the local Veteran Honor Initiative? The voice was polite, calculated. I imagined Lauren's people had circulated talking points. I imagined a reconciliation photo, 2 daughters smiling, captioned, bridging the divide. Whitlow called that afternoon. They're clearly posturing. You've gained ground. The public is seeing the edits for what they are. He asked if I wanted to respond with a press statement, perhaps an op-ed. I looked at the notepad on my desk, still blank. I placed the pen down without uncapping it. They're not reaching out for me, I said. They're reaching out for what I accidentally revealed. He paused, then cheered. That night I made soup from scratch. No recipe. Just muscle memory and guesswork. The broth came out thin, but the steam settled nicely against the kitchen window. I let it cool before eating. No one corrected the seasoning. The kettle whistled once and stopped. I didn't move to silence it. The next morning, a thick envelope arrived. Inside a brochure for a gala Lauren's foundation was hosting. The theme, rebuilding bridges. Tucked in the corner, a handwritten postscript, would mean a lot if you came. They're expecting you. L. No name, just the initial, as if she'd been signing autographs all day and didn't have the energy to finish mine. I didn't RSVP. I walked down to the lake that afternoon. The wind shifted slightly, blowing from the north. A single folding chair sat near the water, leftover from summer fishermen. I didn't sit, just watched the surface move in small, chaotic patterns that still added up to stillness from a distance. I remembered the voice of my father once saying, "Some people don't want the truth. They just want the version that flatters them." He'd been half drunk, not cruel, just tired. I think that was the last time he spoke to me without correction in his tone. The truth as I'd lived it didn't fit on a brochure. At the grocery store, a woman recognized me. Her eyes lingered a beat longer than polite. Then she leaned closer, lowered her voice. "Don't let them spin it back on you. We saw what happened." I nodded, not in agreement, but in quiet acknowledgement that someone noticed without needing to be told how to feel. The news cycle moved quickly after that. Lauren's team released a carefully staged family photo, everyone facing forward, except me. I wasn't in it. I wasn't even cropped out. I had never been invited. Whitlow called again. I didn't answer. I left the phone on the counter and walked outside without a jacket. The air pinched at my skin just enough to remind me where I was. Back in the cabin, I opened the drawer and took out the letter Emily had sent. The edges had curled slightly from humidity. I read it once more, not for new information, but to remind myself what sincerity looked like in ink. Forgiveness doesn't begin with a press release. It doesn't come printed on cardstock or whispered over lukewarm tea during a photo op. It begins where pretense ends. And I haven't seen that from them. Not yet. Not once. Some names matter less when no one's asking for them. At the Ash Hollow Veterans Women's Center, no one mentioned my past. They knew me only as the woman who unlocked the door early, wiped the whiteboard after class, and brought her own beans for the office coffee maker, the kind that smell like real mornings, not waiting rooms. I didn't wear insignias. The name tag on my desk just read, Vivian. No rank, no titles, just 8 letters that didn't need to be validated. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I taught tactical navigation and basic first aid. The room was small 12 folding chairs, mismatched mugs, and a water cooler that wheezed every time someone leaned on it. No one asked for credentials. They listened. They nodded. Sometimes they didn't. That wall was fine, too. I stopped carrying my military ID in my wallet. Not because I disowned it, just because I no longer needed it to explain why I took up space. The boots I wore were broken in from real use. One of the women, Bree, once glanced down and muttered, "Those aren't from the PX." I didn't correct her. She knew. At lunch, the women mostly stayed quiet. Trauma doesn't introduce itself. It hangs back until someone else says "me too," and even then, it might stay silent. I learned to listen without chasing answers, just letting the air hold things we weren't ready to name. On a Thursday afternoon, I sat alone folding donated blankets. A girl no older than 20 stood in the doorway. Sarah Whitman. New. Still stiff in how she walked, like every step asked permission. She stared at the floor, then at the chair, then at me. "I like it here. You don't look at me like I'm broken." She didn't wait for a reply, just blinked once and tucked her hands into her sleeves. I handed her a cup of warm tea I'd brewed that morning, chamomile and mint slightly oversteeped. She held it like something sacred. I didn't respond. There was nothing to add that wouldn't cheapen what she'd already said. At home, the tea kettle clicked off on its own. I let the steam curl around the edges of the chipped tile without moving. I'd learned that silence isn't absence. It's the opposite. It's when everything arrives at once, just without a name. I no longer thought in battles or strategy. Some mornings I woke and didn't immediately take mental inventory of exits or loose boards. I still noticed them. I just didn't center my breath around them. I built a shelf by hand for the women's center, uneven edges but steady. One of the volunteers called it stubbornly straight. I let the name stick. Lauren had once told me over Christmas dinner, "You always have to be the strong one. That's why you don't get help." Then she passed the wine to my father, as if her analysis had been a gift. I thought of that shelf every time I heard someone say the word resilient, like it was an apology. The center printed a brochure for community awareness. I wasn't in it. I didn't want to be. They listed classes, services, upcoming fundraisers. I folded one into my journal like a pressed leaf. Not for keepsake, just to remember that value doesn't need a headline. I started wearing my grandmother's ring again, tarnished, slightly too loose on my finger now. It wasn't flashy, just solid. She once told me, "Never tie your worth to a name you didn't choose." I hadn't understood then. I did. Now. One evening, someone knocked on my cabin door and left a box. Inside, donated books, a few photos, and a folded note. He would have been proud, no matter what they say. E. I knew the handwriting. Emily Kramer. Quiet, reliable. She never needed a podium to be believed. I didn't frame the note, just placed it between pages of an old manual I hadn't opened since Kandahar. I taught another class the next day. Bree brought donuts. Sarah sat beside her and passed out pens. No one mentioned hierarchy. No one asked who used to be who. We just taught, learned, sat in silence when needed. When the session ended, I stayed to wipe the board. A faint stain from last week's marker lingered. I let it stay. I walked home that night without checking over my shoulder. The path wasn't lit, but I didn't reach for my flashlight. I used to think I had to be loud to matter, that to prove I'd survived, I needed to show bruises or speak louder than the people who'd erased me. Now I move through spaces without shrinking or asking for applause. I don't need to win a headline or be invited back to be real. I don't need to shine to have weight. I just need to live in my own breath. And for the first time, that's enough. Some goodbyes don't need to be spoken aloud. They settle in the hands, in the pause before a signature, in the sound of a metal key slipping into an envelope. The woman behind the counter didn't look twice. The manila folder rested easily between my palms, edges worn soft from being held too long. Inside it, a notarized document renouncing all legal ties to the Hayes name, and a court-approved petition affirming the name I had chosen instead. Boone. Not for show, not for spite. For the man who once looked at me across a quiet table and said, "Some truths don't need defending, just living." The envelope also held an old house key taped to a note. I hadn't written more than one line. Keep it if someone needs to feel they've won. No one asked what the package contained. I pressed the prepaid label onto the surface with the weight of something final and slid it into the outgoing bin. The clerk reached for the next customer. I stepped aside. Outside, the air smelled faintly of pine and road dust. I walked the sidewalk back toward the edge of town, my boots soft against the pavement, worn soles catching on tiny cracks. I didn't check my phone. I already knew what would or wouldn't be there. Halfway down the block, I passed the old coffee shop I used to avoid. Too many people from the county board used to linger inside. Too many glances I didn't know how to read. I stopped this time. The door chimed when I entered. No one looked up. The seat by the window was empty. I ordered something mild. The ceramic mug warmed my hands the way I once imagined a welcome home might feel. Not loud, not announced, just present. I unfolded the receipt and traced the faint typeface with one finger. Then I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the leather band I had worn in the field. The name tag had been scratched blank years ago, just metal now cold and undecorated. I placed it beside the mug. Across the cafe, a couple reviewed property listings on a tablet. Someone near the back hummed along to an old radio tune. I let the sound settle. I remembered a night 3 years ago in a hospital hallway outside my father's room. The nurse had said he wasn't responding anymore. Lauren hadn't come. Margaret had stayed home. I sat there with a half-finished crossword, pretending the silence wasn't speaking louder than either of them. When he finally stirred and squeezed my hand, I didn't need him to say anything, but part of me had still waited for it. They never told that part of the story. In the official filings, my name had been redacted from the obituary. In the family vault, my uniform was folded into the corner of a box marked miscellaneous. The medal I surrendered in court never made it back to the records, but none of that was new. What was new was how quiet the air felt now that I had stopped trying to explain myself inside it. At the legal office earlier that day, Thomas had handed me a folder thick with disclaimers and final clauses. If you file this, it's done. Irreversible. I had looked at him. That's the point. He didn't argue. I signed the papers on a counter that was slightly uneven, one leg propped up by an old binder. The pen I used ran out halfway through the second page, so I finished with a different one. The ink didn't match. I didn't mind. Names aren't just about what people call you. They're about who gets to narrate your origin. I had ceded that right for too long. Margaret used to say, you don't get to rewrite history just because you feel left out of it. But I hadn't been left out. I had been erased deliberately, efficiently, and with just enough politeness to confuse guilt with decorum. Lauren had sent another message last week. Let's talk before you make anything permanent. Dad wouldn't want this. I didn't reply. The silence between us had more truth in it than any conversation she could offer. My coffee had gone lukewarm. I drank it anyway. A child tapped on the glass by the entrance, pointing at the wind chime hanging from the awning. It spun once in the breeze. His mother gently pulled him away. No one spoke. On the walk home, I passed a bench overlooking the lake. I sat for a moment, not to think, but to finish not thinking. The envelope was already gone. The name was already changed. The key no longer opened anything that belonged to me. And still, I didn't feel empty. They could keep the house, the vault, the family, crest etched into the mantel. They could keep the photos where I'd been cropped out, and the dinner chairs where no one noticed I wasn't seated. They could even keep the stories they rehearsed until they sounded like memory. But I had the truth, and that was enough. Some mornings arrive without fanfare. They don't ask to be remembered. They just offer themselves quiet, whole enough. The envelope still sat on the table. No address, no stamp. The handwriting was mine, slow and deliberate, centered across the front. If there's a next time, just tell me sooner. I hadn't written anything inside. There wasn't anything left to explain. The breeze lifted the curtain and let it fall again, brushing against the corner of the wooden table I'd sanded down last winter. It still held the scent of linseed oil and thyme. Next to the envelope was the tin teapot dented near the base lid, resting slightly crooked. I hadn't replaced it. I liked the way it hummed before boiling, like it was warning me softly, not everything needs fixing. I opened the dresser drawer slowly. The wood caught on the side the way it always did. Inside the metal. Velvet box, unopened, tucked beneath a folded flannel cloth. It hadn't seen daylight in months. No one had asked about it. Beside it was a letter with 2 creases and a faded signature. His handwriting had shifted near the end. Still the words held. Let her live in peace, not in pain. I didn't touch the paper. I knew the weight of it by memory. Beneath the letter was a photograph. He wore the red plaid shirt he never let Mom donate. His sleeves were rolled up to the elbows. The model airplane rested unfinished on the bench, but his smile wasn't waiting for anything. No ceremony. Just an afternoon caught in stillness. I didn't cry. That was someone else's version of closure. The mug on the table was cold. I took a sip anyway. Mint always tasted better, a little steeped past its time. I hadn't worn my ID badge in weeks. No one at the center had asked why. Most days I arrived early, checked the windows, brewed coffee. The women didn't care about my past. They remembered my hands more than my title. Some of them carried silence like armor. I didn't try to unfasten it. On Thursdays, Sarah stayed late after class. She kept her coat zipped even when the heat was on. One morning, as I was wiping down the counter, she stood by the door, longer than usual. "You probably don't remember me," she said. "But I remember how you sat next to me and didn't ask questions when I couldn't speak." I handed her a clean mug and filled it halfway. "Sometimes being there is enough." She nodded and left the door open behind her. I didn't follow. The mail that afternoon brought nothing. Bills. One flyer for a fundraiser I wouldn't attend. I let them rest in this entry tray without opening them. The phone stayed off. No alerts. No forwarded interviews. No edited headlines. I didn't miss them. There was a time when silence felt like punishment. Now it felt like an answer that no longer required translation. In the evening I heated water again and set the old tin pot on the stove. The flame was low. The handle warmed slowly in my palm. I poured the tea into the ceramic mug with the chip at the rim and stepped out to the porch. The air outside didn't carry noise, just the rustle of dry leaves against pine. The sky was that in-between color that doesn't show up in pictures. Some birds nested in the branches near the chimney. One of them fluttered but didn't fly off. I sat in the chair that faced the trees. There was another beside it, unfinished wood, plain and narrow. No one had asked why I placed it there. I hadn't explained. It wasn't empty because I was waiting. It wasn't symbolic. It was just space that once didn't exist for me, and now did. I traced the edge of the mug with one thumb and let the rest settle. They still had the name, the press releases, the locked cabinets full of family albums where my face had been trimmed out so carefully the edges didn't fray. I had none of those things, but I had the drawer, the letter, the flannel, the photograph that no one knew I kept. And I had this chair. There would be no reunion, no camera crew waiting to document my recovery, no headline about forgiveness. There would just be the porch, the quiet, and the tea that never asked me to be more than present. I didn't need to be seen to know I existed. I didn't need to be believed to live honestly. And for once, that was enough.